Assalamualaikum. Whose Land, Whose Promise by Gary Birch explores the issue of the Promised Land and Christian support for Israel. What was God's promise to Abraham? Was the promise unconditional? Are Christians expected to support Israel because those who bless Israel will be blessed? Since the birth of Israel, a moment celebrated by millions of Christians, many people have suffered. Since 1948, over 400 Arab villages have been either destroyed by bulldozers or occupied by Israeli residents, despite UN resolutions calling for the rightful return of these homes and lands to their Arab owners. According to UN records, in June 1999, about 3.6 million Palestinian refugees have been the victims of Israel's nationhood. Palestinian refugee community is the largest in the world. In order to understand the issue of the Promised Land in the correct context, it is imperative that we understand the events that led to the formation of Israel. The plot to steal Palestinian land started long before the Holocaust. In 1895, Theodore Herzl wrote in his diary that the removal of Arabs from Palestine is part of the Zionist plan. Joseph Ritz stated that there is no room for Arabs in the country. He wanted Israel without Arabs. Ben-Gurion wanted to prevent Arabs who fled from returning. To guarantee that, villages were destroyed and wells were poisoned with typhus and dysentery bacteria. When an entire town became sick, Jewish forces occupied the town and looted Arab homes. In 1948, Israeli planes dropped leaflets in Palestinian villages warning people to get out or be killed. After they left, Israeli settlers simply moved into Palestinian homes. In some villages, the Israeli forces carried out mass arrest of all males aged 14 to 60. They were taken to detention camps where they were tortured by the Shin Bet. Israel was built by conquest and confiscation of another people's land, resulting in millions of refugees. Israel confiscates land that are of strategic value for water, agriculture, and military advantage. This is the game played for centuries by whoever that wants to control the land. Israel also steals water. The average Israeli consumes 348 liters of water a day, but the average Palestinian is only given 70 liters. If Palestinians want more water, they have to pay 4 times the price. In the summer of 1998, 500,000 Palestinians were without water for 2 months. Palestinians had to watch their children go thirsty, while Jewish settlers next door watered their gardens and swam in their pools. In 2006, when Hamas won the election, Israel imposed a blockade that paralyzed Gaza. In 2009, the US State Department offered scholarships to disadvantaged Gazans. Israel imposed a travel ban so that the students cannot leave Gaza, and the scholarships were eventually cancelled. This is one of many quiet persecutions to cultivate toxic levels of despair among Palestinians. The pertinent questions are: what was God's covenant with Abraham? What was the promise? The package deal includes the following. Firstly, Abraham would receive the land as an everlasting possession. Abraham's posterity will become a great nation. Third, an everlasting covenant will bind Abraham and his descendants to God. And finally, all people of the earth will be blessed through Abraham and his descendants. However, the promise was conditional. The land is to be an everlasting possession, provided Abraham and his descendants remain faithful in their relationship with God. Possessing the land was contingent to Israel's consistently living by God's righteous standards. If Israel defied God's law, the land itself will eject them out. Breaking the law means losing the land. Who really owns the land? Leviticus 25:23 states that Israel does not own the land. God does. Israel is a tenant, not the landlord. The first 6 books of the Bible never used the phrase the land of Israel, but calls it the land of Canaan. Sarah, Abraham's wife, died at Kiriath Arba, which is present-day Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Abraham decided to bury Sarah at a certain plot of land and went to see the landowner to offer him a fair price for it. He didn't demand that the land was surrendered to him because God gave him the land. How are Israelites instructed to deal with people who were already living in the land before they arrived? Land and righteousness are linked. Fidelity to covenant righteousness is a prerequisite to enjoying the blessing of the covenant. When any generation neglects the covenant, the land is conquered by foreign power. The nation built by Saul, David, and Solomon was not culturally monolithic, not the Jewish state that present-day Israel aims to be. During the time of Saul, David, and Solomon, non-Jews were neither marginalized nor expelled. Different cultures were integrated into mainstream national life. Keeping the land hinges on obeying the law. The aliens who lived along Israelites should not be oppressed or discriminated. Leviticus 19:33-34 remind Israelites that there were once aliens in Egypt. Israel was commanded to create a society that stood the test of its goodness in how they treat non-Israelites. For example, David paid fair market price for a piece of land he bought. By failing to treat aliens fairly, Israel has forgotten not only its theological history, but also its own suffering in 20th century Europe. The Old Testament links justice to the land. Prophets like Jeremiah, Amos, Isaiah, and Ezekiel had little patience for those who ignored righteousness. Kings who destroyed innocent people and their homes soon faced a prophet. For example, Ahab faced Elijah, and King David was disqualified from building God's holy temple because he slaughtered many people. Prophets warned against aggressive taking of lands or abuse of landowners. Every Old Testament prophet repeats the same thing. Covenant land promise is tied to obeying God's law, and Israel's violation of the law would lead to the necessary judgment. Jeremiah identified many wrongs, among them abuse of resident aliens who live in the land. If orphans, widows, and aliens are abused, God will refuse to dwell with Israel in the land. God sent prophets to warn Israelites when they strayed from God's law. Prophets who warned them that God's promise is contingent on them being righteous. If they didn't mend their ways, they were expelled from the land. For example, in 586 BC, Babylonian armies conquered the land and destroyed Jerusalem and took survivors captive. Who are the prophets of modern-day Israel? Many Israeli groups decry the abuses of Palestinians by the Israeli government. Among them are ICAT, B'Tselem, Neturei Karta, and Jewish Voice for Peace. Rabbis for Human Rights organizes walks along the occupation barrier and read from Isaiah 1:27. Judaism is not the problem, secularism is. Post-Zionist scholars have been challenging fundamental myths about the foundation of Israel, such as a land with no people for a people without land. Also challenge are stories about ill-equipped Holocaust survivors facing a hostile British government and Arabs who wanted to annihilate them. The truth is, the Israel army was superior in every respect. Jerusalem had a long non-Jewish history before it was captured by King David. It was conquered and destroyed within 700 years. Destruction and exile were interpreted as judgment by God. Jesus emphasized this judgment in his vineyard and the tenants parable. After Roman expulsion of Jews from Jerusalem in 135 CE, they lost control of the city for over 1800 years. Looking at the historical cultural dominance in Jerusalem, Israel's historic claim is only a small portion of history. Arab claim to Jerusalem is significant. For the last 2,000 years, Judaism dominated Jerusalem for only 200 years. In 2012, there were 98 checkpoints in the West Bank and 57 of them were internal. The wall isolates and excludes Palestinian communities that were part of Jerusalem so that they have no access to Jerusalem. The separation wall is not about security. It's about economic control because these areas are forced to trade with Israel for goods and services. Often, the barrier does not divide Arabs and Jews. It hems in Palestinians so that they cannot contact each other. Assuming that there is a continuity between the Old Testament and the 21st century, how does Israel's national life compare with the life of God's people outlined in the Bible? If Israel qualifies prophetically, does it also qualify ethically and morally to be God's people in the land? Israel's occupation and oppressive policies against Palestinians clearly break the righteousness code required to abide by God's law. In 1975, US classifies Zionism as racism. In 1998, the Association of Civil Rights in Israel accused the government of race-based discrimination. Allegra Pacheco, a Brooklyn-born Jew, defends Palestinians in Israeli courts because she is deeply offended by Israeli discrimination. She stated that a Jewish state can never be democratic to all its citizens. Even though this book was written for a Christian audience, I recommend it for anyone who would like to understand the issue from a biblical perspective. You can get this book using the links in the description. If you like listening to me babbling about books, please subscribe and turn on notification. Thank you. Assalamualaikum. The author argues that many of the major global conflicts and political events of the 20th century were driven by a hidden agenda, the pursuit and control of oil. The Anglo-American interests have used the economic and military power to secure control over the world's oil reserves. This has been the primary motive behind events ranging from World War I to more recent conflicts in the Middle East. The author discusses how oil has been used as a geopolitical weapon. Oil is not just a commodity, but a crucial instrument of world domination. He traces the history of how the UK and later the US realized that controlling oil gives them unparalleled power over other countries' economies and military capabilities. The book presents a revisionist history suggesting that the conventional explanations for major wars and political upheavals are incomplete. It argues that oil interests and financial cartels have often operated covertly, influencing or even instigating conflicts to maintain the economic and political dominance. A significant part of this book focuses on the post-World War I era and the creation of the petrodollar system, which mandates that oil must be traded in US dollars. This system was a deliberate strategy to ensure global demand for the dollar, strengthening US economic hegemony and allowing it to exert financial control over other nations. The author provides specific historical examples to support his claims. For instance, he links the UK's actions in World War I to its desire to secure Middle Eastern oil supplies. Much later on, the overthrow of Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in the 1950s was a move to protect Anglo-American oil control. The author alludes to the idea that the long-term strategies have created a global power structure designed to serve a select elite. He suggests that this system relies on military intervention, financial manipulation, and even psychological operations to maintain its control. This book gives several examples of Anglo-American meddling in other countries to secure or monopolize oil resources. There are often the hidden motives behind major political events. For example, in the early 20th century, Germany planned to build a railway from Berlin to Baghdad. This project was a significant threat to British control of the seas because it would have given Germany direct land access to the oil-rich Middle East, bypassing British naval dominance. Britain's opposition to this railway was a primary, though often unstated, reason for its increasing antagonism towards Germany in the years leading up to World War I. The British government saw the railway as a strategic threat to its future access to oil, which was becoming vital for its navy and industrial economy. In the early 1950s, Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which was a British company that controlled Iran's oil. The British government was enraged by the loss of its profitable monopoly and sought to overthrow Mossadegh with the help of the US. The CIA orchestrated a coup d'etat in 1953 through a joint operation known as Operation Ajax. The coup successfully overthrew Mossadegh and restored the Shah to power. Subsequently, the British monopoly was replaced by a consortium of mostly American and British companies, effectively re-establishing foreign control over Iran's oil. The author frames the Suez Crisis as a conflict over energy control. After the US and UK withdrew funding for the Aswan Dam, Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, which is a crucial gateway for shipping oil from the Persian Gulf to Europe. UK and France, in a joint effort with Israel, invaded Egypt to regain control of the canal. The US, however, publicly condemned the invasion and used its financial leverage to force the UK to withdraw its troops. This was the pivotal moment where the US began to supplant UK as the dominant power in the region, asserting its own control over global oil flows. The breakup of Yugoslavia was linked to Anglo-American geopolitical interests, although not directly to oil in the same way as the Middle East. It was more about the strategic control of Europe and maintaining and containing potential rivals. In 1990, the US Congress passed the Foreign Operations Appropriation Law, which provided that any part of of Yugoslavia that failed to declare independence from Yugoslavia within 6 months would lose US financial support. It demanded separate elections supervised by the US State Department. The Bush administration demanded the dissolution of the Yugoslav Federation, lighting the fuse for a series of Balkan wars. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, and other Western financial institutions have used economic pressure and structural adjustment programs in the late 1980s and early 1990s to destabilize Yugoslavia's economy. By imposing harsh austerity measures and forcing privatization, these policies exacerbated ethnic and regional tensions, making the country ripe for conflicts. The US is the largest shareholder and a key influencer in IMF. It has been known to use its power to promote policies that it claims would stabilize the country's economy, but have actually harmed developing countries. This influence is often exerted through the conditions attached to IMF loans. The US uses IMF as a tool to dominate the economies of developing countries. Its foreign policy has relentlessly pursued global control over oil and the financial systems that manage it. The IMF is a key instrument in this strategy. Critics have argued that IMF policies are a form of neo-colonialism. Rather than directly invading or colonizing other nations, the US uses IMF to exert control. By forcing countries to open their markets and privatize assets, they create opportunities for multinational corporations from the US and other Western countries to dominate these economies, which benefits the US in its corporate interests at the expense of the developing country's economic sovereignty and social well-being. The author contends that this process is a modern form of financial colonialism, where countries are kept in a state of perpetual economic dependence. Here is an example of how IMF policies have devastated developing countries. Yugoslavia's GDP sank by 7.5% in 1990 and another 15% in 1991. Industry production plunged 21%. IMF demanded wholesale privatization of state enterprises, resulting in the bankruptcy of more than 1,000 companies by 1990 and more than 20% unemployment rate. IMF ordered all wages frozen at the 1989 levels, while inflation rose dramatically, causing real earnings to fall 41% by the first 6 months of 1990. By 1991, inflation was over 140%. The IMF plays a direct role in the Anglo-American strategy for controlling global energy resources. Countries with significant oil or other strategic resources are partially susceptible to this type of financial pressure. By controlling a nation's economy through debt and imposed policies, the US can ensure favorable access to its resources and prevent the company from aligning with rival powers. The IMF is a non-military arm of a broader geopolitical strategy to maintain global hegemony by controlling resources and finance. I learned a few new facts from this book. Did you know that the US not only played a role in overthrowing Mossadegh and reinstalling the Shah, but also later played a role in communists coming to power? I took a while to process some of the information in this book. I'm no longer surprised by the evil and greed of the elite who would do anything to secure their interest, influence, and profits. They don't care what pain they inflict on ordinary people, most of whom are clueless about the power game that the elite plays. This book is definitely a must-read. You can get it using the link in the description. If you like listening to me babbling about books, please subscribe and turn on notification. Thank you. Assalamualaikum. Zionism began as an evangelical Christian project. It is a religious appeal to help and prepare for the return of the Jews to Palestine to establish a Jewish state as the fulfillment of God's will. Later, the Christians involved in this campaign politicized the theology of return when they realized that a similar movement had emerged among European Jews who despaired of finding a solution to anti-Semitism in Europe. The Christian desire to see a Jewish Palestine coincided with a similar European Jewish vision in the late 19th century. Subsequently, it gave birth to lobby groups to gather support for a Jewish homeland. When Theodor Herzl started spreading his idea for a Jewish state, the impoverished working-class Jews were very receptive to his idea, while the elite Jews remained aloof. The latter had no reason to abandon their comfortable life in Europe. Herzl looked down on the former and denigrated them, but realized they were more amenable to moving to Palestine. Ilan Papi critically examines the evolution, influence and activities of pro-Israel lobby groups, particularly in the US. He traces the origin of Zionist lobbies back to the 19th century and highlights the collaboration between Christian Zionists who wanted to hasten the Second Coming and Jewish Zionists who wanted to help European Jews escape anti-Semitism. Together, they persuaded the British government to support the establishment of a Jewish state, culminating in the Balfour Declaration in 1917. Balfour had no sympathy for the plight of Jews. In 1905, he supported the Aliens Act to stop an influx of Jews fleeing the pogroms of Eastern Europe. Some scholars suspect he was actually driven by anti-Semitism. He did not want more Jewish immigrants in Britain. Herzl himself repeatedly told the British and Germans that the Zionist colonization of Palestine would divert the dreaded Jewish immigrants from Western Europe to Palestine. Herzl suggested that a Jewish state could serve not only British interests in Asia, but those of the Western world. According to him, it would be in the interest of the civilized nations to have a cultural station in Asia. A Jewish state would contribute an element of stability to Asian politics. This book discusses how the Zionist lobby groups have shaped US foreign policy in favor of Israel. It explores the historical context, strategies, and impacts of the lobbying activities, arguing that they often prioritize Israel's interests over US interests and broader considerations of peace and justice in the Middle East. Here is an example of how AIPAC influenced US foreign policy. AIPAC began lobbying for US to invade Iraq in December 2001 until it was approved by Congress in 2002. It hinted that Yasser Arafat was among those behind the 9/11 attack. Years later, the 9/11 Commission report stated that there was no evidence to support the allegation. AIPAC collaborated with the Israeli government, neocons, and Christian Zionists to make the invasion of Iraq possible, resulting in a series of catastrophes: civil war, state collapse, refugee crisis, and the rise of ISIS. After World War II, the neocons joined forces with Christian and Jewish Zionists in the US to advocate for Israel as a bulwark against communism. The author discusses the method the lobby groups use to influence policy makers, including exerting pressure on Congress, suppressing dissent within political parties, and conducting smear campaigns against critics. They also secured military aid for Israel and pushed for the recognition of unlawfully occupied territories, often denying Palestinian rights. The author highlights the cognitive dissonance among 20th century Zionist advocates as they justified increasing violence against Palestinians. The Zionist lobby groups have shaped the political culture in the US and UK, affecting politicians' ability to address Israel's abuses of Palestinians. When politicians or public figures refuse to support Israel or criticizes Israeli policies, the lobby employs various strategies to marginalize them. For example, Jeremy Corbyn, the US Labour Party leader, was labeled as an anti-Semite, leading to him being ousted in 2020. The lobby groups have used many tactics to pressure, discredit, or sideline politicians and advocates who refuse to support Israel. Among the tactics are smear campaigns and accusations of anti-Semitism, political pressure and intimidation, censorship and career damage, intervention in elections, loss of institutional support, and manipulating legislative and legal actions. These tactics create a chilling effect, discouraging people from openly debating and criticizing Israeli policies, regardless of their personal beliefs or human rights concerns. This is especially the case in the US, where supporting Israel is seen as a bipartisan issue. The author proposes several ways to counter the lobby's influence. Among steps that can be taken are raising public awareness by promoting open debate and education, countering the criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic, grassroots activism and political pressure, breaking the political consensus, reforming campaign finance, holding politicians accountable, and supporting alternative voices, challenging media bias, and international solidarity. The author believes that dismantling the lobby's power requires persistent public pressure, strategic political engagement, and a commitment to upholding free speech and human rights. At the beginning of the book, the author poses this question: why does Israel still lobby for its legitimacy more than 7 decades after its establishment? Defenders of Israel are constantly beset by self-doubt about the state's legitimacy, fueling the campaign to justify a project and later a state that could only be founded and sustained by the constant oppression of another nation. They react strongly to Israel's critics because they know the critics have a point, and they cannot deny it. Sykes and his compatriots in the British War Cabinet had one thing in common when committing to an Anglo-Zionist Palestine. They knew practically nothing about Palestine. Politicians were reluctant to support a Zionist project, were aware it would be unpopular with Palestinians. Prominent Jews dreaded the impact of the project on the Anglo-Jewish community as a whole, but had no regard for the Palestinian lives it would affect. What has transpired in the past 18 months is a testament to the far-reaching influence of the Zionist lobby. Despite refutable, mounting evidence of a genocide, critics of Israel continues to be silenced on all platforms. I like Ilan Pappy's writing style. It flows nicely and is easy to understand. You can get this book using the link in the description. There is also a link to the author talking about this book. If you like listening to me babbling about books, please subscribe and turn on notification. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. This book critically explores Muslim identity, political sovereignty, and the concept of the caliphate in the post-colonial era. It discusses the decline of the caliphate and its implication for the Muslim world, especially in the context of colonialism and post-colonialism. It examines the historical, political, and cultural significance of the caliphate, which was abolished in 1924 by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of modern Turkey. Rather than viewing it as merely a historical institution, it examines how the idea of the caliphate represents Muslim self-determination and alternative political imagination. The author argues that the caliphate serves as a symbol of Muslim political agency and an alternative to Western-dominated global order. The end of the caliphate marked a profound shift in the Muslim world, leading to a crisis of authority and identity. He examines how the colonial powers exploited this vacuum to impose their systems of governance and control, thus shaping the modern world order. He criticizes the contemporary global political system, which is dominated by Western norms and values, often at the expense of Muslim societies. He critiques how Western hegemony has shaped global political discourse, marginalizing Muslim political aspirations. Up to the last quarter of the previous century, Islam was expected to dissipate as the global advance of westernization brought secularization and modernization. Not only has Islam failed to follow the trajectory of confining it to the private sphere and demilitarization, it has, on the contrary, forcefully reasserted its public presence in the world. This book discusses how Islamist movements challenge secularism and the Western nation-state model. It places Muslim political struggles within the broader context of world order, questioning how power is distributed globally. It is a theoretical and post-colonial critique that offers a fresh perspective on Islam's role in contemporary geopolitics. The author calls for a rethinking of the caliphate not as a return to a medieval institution, but as a symbol of resistance against Western hegemony and a means of reasserting Muslim agency in global affairs. He suggests that the concept of the caliphate can serve as a framework for imagining alternative forms of political and social organization that are more inclusive and just. This book wouldn't be complete without discussing the challenges of re-establishing the caliphate, but not in the sense of returning to the historical model. It explores the deeper political, ideological, and structural obstacles that are preventing Muslims from asserting a unified political agency on the global stage. I'm going to highlight only 3 of the challenges discussed in this book. First, colonial legacies and nation-states. The modern world is structured around the nation-state system, which was largely imposed on Muslim-majority regions during and after colonial rule. This system fragments Muslim political unity and reinforces Western dominance in global politics. The abolition of the caliphate was a pivotal moment in the decline of Muslim political power and the rise of Western-dominated global order. Re-establishing the caliphate would require overcoming the legacy of colonialism, which fragmented Muslim societies and imposed Western political systems. This fragmentation makes it difficult to unify Muslim majority regions under one political entity. Second, Western hegemony and Islamophobia. Western powers have continued to marginalize Muslim political aspirations, often portraying any attempt to reimagine Muslim governance outside the Western nation-state model as extremist or a threat to world order. Third, diverse interpretation of the caliphate. One of the major challenges is the lack of consensus among Muslims about what the caliphate should look like in the modern world. The caliphate is often romanticized or idealized, but its historical reality was complex and contested. Different groups have varying interpretation of its role, structure, and relevance, making it difficult to achieve a unified vision. Muslims are not united on what a political reassertion of Islam should look like. Differences in sectarian, national, and ideological perspectives make it difficult to conceptualize a unified caliphate. The author does not offer a step-by-step solution to the challenges, but he proposes ways to rethink Muslim political agency in the post-colonial framework. He is more concerned with how Muslims can reclaim political subjectivity rather than prescribing a specific political system. I'm going to highlight only 3 of the proposed solutions. First, reimagine Muslim political identity. Muslims need to move beyond the constraints of Western political models such as nation-state and secularism and develop a political identity rooted in Islamic traditions and history. Second, reimagine the caliphate as a symbol of resistance. The caliphate should not be understood as a literal return to a historical institution, but as a symbolic framework for challenging Western hegemony and reasserting Muslim agency. This involves using the idea of the caliphate to inspire unity and resistance against oppressive global structure and focusing on the caliphate as a metaphor for justice, equality, and self-determination rather than a specific political identity. Third, decolonize Muslim thought and politics. The author emphasizes the need to decolonize Muslim societies by rejecting the imposed frameworks of the nation-state and Western political systems. This would involve developing alternative political and economic models that are rooted in Islamic principles but adapted to modern realities. It should also encourage intellectual and cultural movements that challenge Eurocentric narratives and reclaim Islamic heritage. Overall, this book is thought-provoking and challenges readers to reconsider the historical and contemporary relevance of the caliphate in the context of global power dynamics and the quest for decolonization. Instead of advocating for a restoration of the historical caliphate, it examines how Muslims can assert political subjectivity in a world shaped by colonial Muslims can assert political subjectivity in a world shaped by colonial legacies. You can get this book using the link in the description. There is also a link to an interview with the author. If you like listening to me babbling about books, please subscribe and turn on notification. Thank you.